I am delighted to have this opportunity to introduce the volume Diagnostics for a Globalized World by myself and my co-author Ruzanna Tarverdyan, published earlier this year by World Scientific and Now publishers. Very briefly, our book deals with the challenge of understanding the success or lack of success of nation states in achieving reasonable goals of social and economic policy, such as the Millennium Development Goals formulated by the United Nations. For those states that we find lacking, we calculate their shortfalls and identify peer nations that might serve as policy models. Let me start with something simple: indices. The gross domestic product gives the first clue about the economic performance of a nation. In addition, many have expressed the wish to expand the GDP to account for environment and social factors. For instance, Harvard professor Michael Porter earlier this year unveiled a social progress index, even extended the calculations to reflect personal freedom and choice. That index collects statistics on 52 indicators from 133 countries. The tiny Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan ventured even further, setting its goal to increase the gross national happiness of the nation. Picking up on the Bhutan idea, the United Nations in 2011 invited member states to measure the happiness of their people, resulting in an annual World Happiness Index, ranking the happiness performance of 156 countries. There is an obvious danger to these statistical exercises. As more data of different kinds are packed into a single index, the interpretation of the resulting jumble becomes difficult. And is it fair to seek a global coverage of an index of progress or happiness when there are so vast differences between rich and poor countries, between stable economies and nations ravaged by disease and war? Is it fair to compare wealth with hunger, to compare order with disorder? Since the days of Adam Smith and Alfred Marshall, economics has been the science of economic man, some fictitious rational individual who, weighing all possible courses of action, chooses the one that maximizes utility. A widely used definition of economics states that it is the science of allocating given means to obtain a set of desirable ends. But in the real world, there are also suboptimal decision makers that are not very good at solving that optimizing problem. The great Dutch economist Jan Tinbergen in the early 1950s wrote 2 volumes that more or less came to codify the theory of economic policy. Tinbergen called for the coordination of available policy tools to maximize social utility. Once having specified the social welfare function as precisely as possible, he said, one should then use it for finding the socio-economic optimum. That's a direct quote from his Nobel lecture in 1969. And yet, in retrospect, Tinbergen's work turned out to be a dead end. Many political bodies do not maximize utility. They act irrationally. Politicians may pay lip service to the true needs of the common citizen, but rather promote their own pet projects. The tools of national economic and social policy may be poorly coordinated. A realistic analysis requires that we allow for the existence of non-economic man executing economic and social policy. In a sense, our work picks up the theory of economic policy where Tinbergen left it. Following him, we do form a social economic preference function of the policy goals of each nation. We determine that preference function empirically using data like the Millennium Development Goals. But we do not assume that each nation necessarily follows the neoclassical maxims of equilibrium. Since Tinbergen's days, economics has discovered phenomena like irrational behavior, disequilibrium, and even chaos. There may exist a gap between the idealized optimum solution and actual performance. Our work is a case of frontier economics. Frontier nations are able to coordinate available policy tools to achieve an optimal mix of social and economic goals. Nations behind the frontier are outperformed by those at the frontier. In frontier economics, the true dichotomy is between order and excellence on the one hand, and disorder and disequilibrium on the other. But remember, order can also be found in poor countries, just as chaos may reign among the ranks of the mighty. The frontier nations define the frontier of the doable. The others are sub-frontier, falling short of the doable. To improve, a sub-frontier nation might find it instructive to look at its nearest frontier neighbors. Frontier economics recognizes the presence of old-fashioned idealized equilibrium economics and the presence of sub-frontier decision-making. The task of distinguishing between the two is an empirical one. Order is not postulated, but is a matter of testing, of examining the data. Employing methods of operations research, it is possible to determine numerically the envelope to a given set of data points. The envelope is the frontier. In modern high-tech lingo, the expression pushing the envelope means going beyond what is technically possible today. More strictly, the envelope is a geometrical term referring to the locus of tightest closure around a given collection of points. Processing data on the achievements or lack of achievements of the United Nations Millennium Goals, we have in our book split more than 100 nations into two groups. those located at the envelope, and those that are falling behind. For each such sub-envelope nation, we have determined its closest role models located on the envelope. The envelope is a surface in many dimensions, when one dimension for each policy goal and each policy instrument. Rather than packing all given data into a single dubious index of economic progress or happiness, the envelope spells out all the desired aspects of the performance of a nation explicitly. For a sub-frontier or sub-envelope nation, we calculated the possible improvements of its performance. The role models or peers turned out to be drawn from all continents, representing both rich and poor countries. For instance, ranking the competitiveness of nations, and we combined data from the US Council of Competitiveness with those of the World Economic Forum. We were able to identify 42 peer nations that defined the envelope. But a country like Bulgaria fell behind the frontier. It is dominated by its two peers, Estonia and Venezuela. The GDP per person employed in Bulgaria is equivalent to US dollars $19.20. Its target achievement, an average of the results of its peers, would have been $22.38. The identification of a nation's peers should be both equitable and helpful. The peers are not necessarily the masters of the world, but they feature goal achievements that can suggest to others a possible potential for improvement.